This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, everyone in the room. Thank you for those of you who are joining us online. My name is Dr. Katrina Dowd, and I'm an assistant professor in University College Dublin, and I'm delighted to be here today to welcome you to the event, which is part of the 2026 Development Matter Lecture Series here at IIEA and supported kindly by Irish Aid. We're delighted to be joined today by Pierre Krähenbühl, Director-General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. DG Krähenbühl will deliver an address entitled "A World in Crisis, Addressing the Humanitarian Impact of Rising Global Conflicts," and then we're going to open up to Q&A from our audience. For those of you in the room, please feel free to raise your hand. We'll come to you with a mic. For those of you tuning in online, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom, which you should see on your screen. Please, for anyone asking a question, briefly identify yourself before you put a question. And please remember that both the remarks today and the Q&A are on the record. First, I'll formally introduce DG Krähenbühl, and then I will hand over to Director General of Irish Aid, Michael Gaffey, who we're also very pleased to have with us to say a few words today. So Pierre Krähenbühl is the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, a position he assumed in April 2024. As head of the ICRC's executive body, he is responsible for steering the organization's global humanitarian activities. Immediately prior to his current position, he was Secretary General of the Assembly of the ICRC and has dedicated more than 30 years to the humanitarian sector, including 25 in prominent roles in the ICRC, in delegations and headquarters. He's also served as Commissioner General and Under Secretary General of the United Nations at UNWRA, an organization, unfortunately, that we've been hearing a lot about and under considerable strain. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you today on how the ICRC is dealing with the rising number of global conflicts worldwide. But I'll now invite Director General Michael Gaffey to introduce some remarks on behalf of Irish Aid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and welcome, Pierre. This is my second day in a row standing at this podium to welcome people to a Development Matters lecture, which really underlines the importance of this collaboration between the Institute for International and European Affairs and Irish Aid, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Ireland. This space that is opened up to allow discussion of issues that are not necessarily discussed as broadly as they should in Ireland or internationally is really valuable to us. And as you listen to Katrina's description of the career and roles that Pierre has played, you can see that he is the ideal person to be addressing us, to be meeting with us today, which is actually the week on Friday of the International Day of Red Cross and Red Crescent. So it's really important that we are meeting at this time. But the title of Pierre's lecture alone could lead you to despair, which is not his intention. It is not his intention. But the world that we live in, and we discuss it endlessly, but it keeps surprising us. The world that we live in poses massive challenges to people working in the areas of humanitarian response and in the area of development cooperation, or working even for a peaceful, what we might term a peaceful and just world. And what I would say is Ireland is one of the strongest and most consistent supporters of the ICRC and of the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, notably the Irish Red Cross Society here. And I would say that the ICRC is a gift from Switzerland to the world, but a gift that we require to keep on giving, because the pressures on it and its work at the moment are really extreme. And I would say that if we did not have the ICRC today, we would have to try and invent it, but it would be very difficult in the current environment, probably, to do so. So our support as a country and as a people is based on the role that the ICRC plays in the most difficult times as the custodian of international humanitarian law, as the custodian of the rules of war, no matter how often they are, and flagrantly, they are broken, and as an absolute paragon of independent humanitarian action. So we are really, really pleased to be consistent supporters of the ICRC. I just want to emphasize today that it is our intention to maintain that commitment, and that, Pierre, I think you can count on Ireland's sustained and committed support as we work together to try and build what our overall development and humanitarian policy optimistically calls a better world. So you're really welcome to Dublin and really welcome to the IIEA. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And without further ado, I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to be here. Katrina, thank you for the introduction. Jill, thank you for the welcome. Michael, for the very warm opening words and welcoming expressions. We have here colleagues, close partners of the ICRC, with meetings that we've had over the last 2 days in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, with colleagues in Irish Aid, with the Irish Red Cross, of course, all very important to the work of the ICRC. So first of all, a word of gratitude for the welcome, for the strong message, Michael, of support to our organization, the generous, consistent, and principled support that we enjoy from Ireland, which makes a huge difference to our work, especially in these uncertain times. I want to touch on a few topics that are important to us at the current juncture, but I think I should start by reflecting on our relationship to war as human beings, simply because I think in every one of our backgrounds, so everyone here in this room or in any other room, the people online, have a relationship in some form to war and armed conflict. It can be in our personal histories and backgrounds. That can be during some of the previous conflicts, World Wars I and II, but of course in also more troubled times here in Ireland, in other continents. Every family somehow can trace back a relationship to a time of armed conflict. And this is something that sits deep in us as human beings. It can be a personal experience of a loss of a relative, someone who went missing in times of war. It can also simply be because we have been impressed or deeply moved by a book that we read, a documentary that we watched, through our personal studies. It can be a poem that impressed us very much about somebody who fought during World War I and would have expressed what he lived through at the time and the emotions and anxieties, and that marked us deeply. It can also be simply through a piece of art that reflected on the realities of war. So there are so many different links to armed conflict and how we relate to it, that it is important to state that I think at times I'm struck by the fact how casual our relationship is to armed conflict. And what I mean by that is that we treat wars as something that is just simply an inescapable reality of being a human. Now, the problem begins when we declare something to be inescapable or inevitable, an inevitable part of the history of humanity. And of course, we can be forgiven for that if we remember all of our studies. Looking back, we all remember what were in our history books, the emphasis on the great dates of the great battles, the names of the great generals. The chapters on the great impacts on civilians were not necessarily as long, or we didn't memorize them as intensely as the dates of the battles and of the names of the generals. But that reality is there. We have been growing up with the idea that wars are just an inescapable part of the human condition. The problem of attitudes that are shaped by something that is inevitable is that one doesn't necessarily always respond to something that one can do nothing about. And so one simply is at the receiving end of an inescapable reality that always catches up with us as human beings. And the good news is that some generations did decide to respond differently. And certainly in the aftermath of World War II, there was a completely different attitude because the horrors had been so extensive. They had been so profound and so transformative in terms of the lives of millions of people on this and every other continent, that there was a particularly productive period in terms of human capacities to bring about new frameworks, which began with the UN Charter, of course, 1945, followed then by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention for the Prohibition of Genocide, and of course the Geneva Conventions of 1949 that established the rules that apply during times of armed conflict, protecting civilians, protecting prisoners and other civilian internees, but then also, of course, the Refugee Convention of 1951. One really has to pay tribute to the generation that managed in those 6 years to produce those frameworks. And the speed with which we are currently seeing narratives to undermine those frameworks is quite striking. And when you think of the promise that is encapsulated, actually a last resort, should be only considered as something defensive in the cases unless otherwise authorized specifically. Well, that promise enshrined in the UN Charter is one where we feel currently the handbrakes are being released, and where the permissive interpretation of that very charter, the attitudes that are now changing, is one whereby wars and conflict are becoming again a tolerated norm, possibly even in some cases a first resort. Diplomacy is sidelined and conflict is being tolerated and promoted, which leads us, of course, to the reality that we're facing today in many environments. We're seeing this proliferation of armed conflicts, the new dynamics around return, to use that oversimplified expression, of conflicts between states, so the international armed conflicts, as we've seen between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, but also, of course, in the recent conflict between Israel, the United States, and Iran, and many others that are spreading, in particular in the Middle East. Of course, we also have long-lasting conflicts that oppose state and non-state armed groups. So all these live side by side in many of the environments that we work in. This proliferation of conflict is a very serious challenge to, of course, the populations impacted, first of all, and I'll come back to some of those consequences, but also to humanitarian organizations. And I would add to the complexity that we're dealing with, that not only are we dealing with a proliferation of conflicts, we're also dealing with a long-lasting average duration of conflict. This is something that is very present and striking in the current time, because most of the situations we're dealing with have been going on for decades. ICRC has been present in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories for 75 years, in Colombia for 55, in Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, the DRC, Sudan for 3 to 4 decades. That tells us something about a deep problem in the international system, a weakness when it comes to preventing wars and resolving wars. And sincerely, it was never the plan for humanitarian organizations to be present in a single context for that long. Also because we were designed originally for being an emergency response, so a few months, a couple of years. And with that, you always had in mind short-term provision of aid, life-saving activities, in our case also visits to prisoners and others, but in general, the concepts were short in their thinking. Now, of course, we're dealing with long-lasting consequences of conflict. And this brings me back to the casual nature of our attitudes towards war, because we're familiar with, of course, the consequences that wars produce. The death, the injury, the separation, the humiliation, the trauma, the torture, and the disappearance of millions in times of conflict. And one of the things that I think we have maybe grown up with is the idea that when wars come to an end, we move to another phase. And yet that's not at all the reality that we experience. And I want to give just one particularly important illustration of that in terms of long-lasting consequences of conflict. And that is when we deal with the issue of missing persons. The issue of missing persons is something that simply does not go away. So we are currently dealing with, for example, 36,000 missing persons in the Syrian context. That's the current numbers that families have approached the ICRC directly with. We're dealing with 225,000 missing persons in the conflict between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. These, again, are numbers of people that have directly approached the ICRC with individual requests. So these are not aggregated numbers. These are documented numbers by the ICRC. And you can go on from one context to the other. I was last week in Brazil, meeting families whose missing relatives go back to the period of the military regime, but also some families who, of course, have missing relatives from the armed violence that impacts several, of course, big cities in Brazil currently. So you can see that for a family that has no news of a loved one, whether that's for a few weeks, a few months, years, or decades, this never goes away. And this I want to underline because it is one of the consequences that's often overlooked, and how that translates and is carried forward one generation after the next into the trauma that families, societies have to address. And reconciliation becomes all the more difficult when this issue isn't addressed and responded to actively and properly. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, we had, at the end of the war in 1996, we had 30,000 individual missing persons registered. We're still in search of 7,000 answers 3 decades later. So it tells us how present these long-lasting consequences are. And therefore, the call, of course, is that we be more decisive in preventing wars, in shortening the span of conflict, but then also being very, very conscious of the consequences of war. And this is what brings us to sometimes find in this period, in particular also in some of the political narratives that we are hearing currently, which are calling for next generations to be prepared, or the younger generations today on all continents, including on the European continent, to be prepared to show the same sense of sacrifice as previous generations. This we should not treat so casually. The speed with which one returns to the logics of war, when in fact on the European continent so much was invested into trying to build peace in a longer term, is also something extremely concerning. We have to be careful about those narratives. Words matter. They shape perceptions. And again, they create the notion that wars are inevitable to the human condition, and that therefore very little can be undertaken to prevent them from happening. I find there's nothing naive about stating that we need antidotes to the limitless capacity of the human being under the wrong conditions and circumstances to inflict violence on other human beings. We have enough experience. If anybody thinks that working the ICRC's perspective or the Red Cross and Red Crescent perspective is too rosy or too naive in this, normally after a few years working in the ICRC, one is often vaccinated against any excessive sense of naivete about the human capacity to inflict violence on other human beings. And this is precisely why we need to build in safeguards. Why, after World War II, the previous generations felt it was necessary not only to limit the possibility to go to war, but also to impose rules when wars do happen that limit the means and methods of warfare available to the parties. Otherwise, it goes out of control, and we end up paying collectively very, very high prices for that. And this leads, of course, to the debate that we have currently about international humanitarian law. When we refer to international humanitarian law, to the Geneva Conventions that have these rules that apply to all parties in times of armed conflict, whatever the nature of that conflict, whether international or non-international, sometimes we run the risk of sounding a little bit abstract. It's a reference, it's a narrative that repeats simply the references to international humanitarian law, and it can sound abstract. In fact, it can even sound like detached from reality when one hears the discourse about the importance of international humanitarian law, and then we see the horror that took place in the Gaza Strip, the extent of the devastation, the level of destruction, of loss of life, of despair in the Gaza Strip over the last 2 years. We can do that in Sudan. We can look at that consequence and come across and saying, why should I be interested in your frameworks if what I see happening every day on my social media feeds in the Gaza Strip or elsewhere is possible under your IHL? That is a very legitimate reaction to it. But again, there, we have to remember that, of course, it's natural that we're focusing a lot on what international humanitarian law does not allow to do, in the sense of when it's not respected, when it's eroded, when it's questioned and challenged and violated. Every day, my colleagues around the world are visiting prisoners in certain locations. Or let me give you a concrete example from Ukraine. Every month, the ICRC meets on the front lines or on the border in meetings with both Ukrainian and Russian Federation officials and the military to either facilitate the safe passage and the return of civilians, of prisoners of war, and particularly once a month of the remains of fallen soldiers who are then brought back both ways. These are very large numbers, on average about 1,000 a month, that are repatriated and then need to be identified. So a painstaking effort. No party in any conflict spontaneously invites you in the midst of their confrontation. So if we didn't have the frameworks of international humanitarian law, our work wouldn't be possible in any of these conflict environments. So we always have to remember that there's a natural tendency, of course, to focus on the violations for very good reasons. We feel the sense of outrage when we see the level of devastation and violence that is directed against civilians, torture inflicted on detainees, lack of protections, and rightly we feel that indignation. But we also have to remember that every day these frameworks are life-saving in what they enable to do. We had established a field hospital that is still running in Gaza during the very intense phase of the conflict. This has allowed for over 200,000 consultations, over 11,000 surgical interventions. 800 children were born into that hospital during these last 2 years. And so, of course, once again, our ability to negotiate this material into and to sustain our operation in the middle of that intense conflict is linked to the fact that we have a mandate grounded in the Geneva Conventions that wouldn't be otherwise possible. Or when in the first phase of the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, a neutral intermediary was required to facilitate the release of the remaining hostages and the return of the bodies of those who were no longer alive, as well as the Palestinian detainees who were released, and also the bodies of those who were no longer alive. We needed to have the mandate anchored in the Geneva Conventions, our role in IHL recognized. So it is very important to also look at everything that these treaties allow us to do. But we have to say that currently there is real concern about the level of erosion, and in particular also the visible violations on the one hand and the deeply dehumanizing narratives that accompany this in the public discourse. This combination is creating a very permissive environment, one that is conducive in a sense to violations and to great breaches of the responsibilities under international humanitarian law. So we see them, we hear about these narratives, and of course one expects then strong reactions on the international stage. And one of the challenges we're faced very evidently is with the double standards in the application, in the discourse by states. And to be very frank, I think Ireland has found a striking and good balance between the way in which it developed its messages on international humanitarian law in different contexts. So I think that balance is one that we haven't seen in all countries, and it's important to highlight that there's also good practices in that regard that need to be recognized. But there really are also more problematic practices currently, and where the same narratives that would be applied to one context, states would have refused to apply to another, where a friend is involved, a partner is involved, etc. And this is, of course, undermining the very foundations of the logics behind international humanitarian law. We've also seen, particularly on the European continent, withdrawals by states from international humanitarian law treaties, such as the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, the Convention on Cluster Munitions. This is very rare in history, withdrawals by states from international humanitarian law treaty. And of course, is sending a signal that essentially, after also telling much of the world which treaties to ratify and where to engage, it was suddenly when one's own national security is challenged that there is then the possibility to withdraw from treaties that were precisely designed not for times of sun and shiny weather, but when the storm is on the horizon. That's the whole point of these treaties. So we need to remobilize around international humanitarian law, because it's not something abstract. These are not just principles and articles and rules that were drafted in the abstract. They are grounded in the experiences of war, and we need to uphold them. So what we did a year and a half ago, in light of the extensive violations that we were witnessing in this time, but also because it was the 75th anniversary of those Geneva Conventions, we decided to launch a global initiative on international humanitarian law to regalvanize political support, political ownership by states parties, since this is a very universally ratified set of treaties. Now, what we did was to launch it with 6 countries at the outset on the margins of the UN General Assembly in September 2024. And we did that with Brazil, China, South Africa, Kazakhstan, Jordan, and France, with the intention of having every continent represented at the launch. And now, in the meantime, 150 countries are actively participating on a regular basis. 108 countries have formally joined. We're very grateful for the active involvement by Ireland, very much in the spirit of the work that Ireland had done in the political declaration on the explosive weapons in populated areas in 2022, and your long-standing tradition on IHL. So this is a very important involvement with the upcoming EU presidency. Gives us another opportunity to work together on promoting this. This IHL initiative has several work streams that go from issues covering the risks faced by medical personnel, medical installations, ambulances, and others in times of conflict, to the questions of IHL in peace, maritime warfare, new technologies deployed on the battlefield. All these themes are being discussed currently, and there will be a closing conference in Jordan at the end of the year. This has created a very strong set of debates around IHL, and we're very grateful for the fact that it has received so much attention, and we will continue to work closely with you in that regard. But it is a very important front line for all of us, unless we want to go into a world where only hard power matters and where no rules exist anymore. Now, I want to close just by saying that indeed, one point that is very important is also to create a horizon where we don't despair in all of this. And I think what gives a lot of source of energy is if you look at strong reactions worldwide, especially among the younger generations. We've seen multiple demonstrations take place, and I'm not focused now on the political dimensions of those demonstrations. It's not my role, but I'm looking at the response, the reaction to the levels of violence and the impact on societies and civilians by a whole range of conflicts in the Middle East, in Africa, and elsewhere. I think that's a fundamentally important reaction, because it's the same reaction, and I compare it very humbly to when our founder arrived at the battlefield of Solferino in the north of Italy over 160 years ago. What he felt and what he saw shocked him deeply, and it shocked him into action. And I think one of the important things, and it's also one of, I think, what makes us proud to work in the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, is that in this Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, we have the privilege, also deep responsibility, to transform the indignation that we often feel on a daily basis into action. And there we're very proud partners here of the Irish Red Cross, but then in many contexts, from the Yemeni Red Crescent to the Iranian Red Crescent that has been very active recently, to the Magen David Adom in Israel, the Palestinian Red Crescent, and many Red Cross and Red Crescent societies around the world that have millions of volunteers that every day are taking risks in very highly delicate environments and transforming that very sense of indignation into action. Now, one can transform one's indignation into action in different ways. Some will choose political activism, others will choose art, others will choose diplomacy. All those are legitimate courses of action. But we need together to refuse the notion, to reject the idea that wars are inevitable. It requires a completely different mindset. We have to re-legitimize the idea that negotiated paths are legitimate and necessary, not that they are a form of surrender. We should refuse the cynicism that often accompanies debates around international humanitarian law, which is sort of suggesting that it's naive to think that one can apply. I think the other side is naive, is to not think that these boundaries are necessary for us. So here's again a front line on which it is worth standing. So refusing the inevitability of war, refusing the cynicism that can accompany the debates on international humanitarian law, and then really actively working to ensure that on every single conflict, in every situation, we help one another to rediscover the humanity in the other. Many thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And a reminder for those of you in the room, if you have a question, please raise your hand and introduce yourself. Those of you joining online, please do the same, share a brief note, and we'll come to a round of questions. I have a question for you that may seem out of left field, and it's partly because I was struck by how many of your remarks seemed to touch on the idea of narrative, on the idea of communication, the threat, the danger of dehumanizing narratives, the exposure people have maybe in social media to the devastation of war and how they may feel IHL is abstract in that concept, the mobilization of often young people against the brutality of war if they're mobilizing and joining civil society movements. I suppose many of us in the room identify as humanitarians or legal scholars. Do we also need to be better storytellers, communicators, narrative formers? Where is that in the thinking, I suppose, strategically of where we are in this humanitarian moment for ICRC?
That's a very interesting point. And I think to start with a bit of a basic reaction to that, I mean, I think we've, in all honesty, probably all participated in panel discussions on humanitarian work where we, enthusiastically recite everything from acronyms like the Nexus and talk about the cluster system, which I'm sure generates a lot of enthusiasm in our own circles, but really has very little to do with the daily experience of people who are impacted by war. And it is very difficult. Even the best photograph, the best documentary, the best book, the best statement one can listen to will find it very, very difficult to translate what the horror of war really means. And for 1 second, we have to start to think what it means when it's your village that is impacted, when the drones fly over your community, or when the shelling starts in your neighborhood, and you have a few seconds to decide what you're going to take with you as you decide to flee. Family photographs, a few belongings, things that you're very attached to. Then, of course, you remember you have a child at school 2 kilometers away. Will you reach in time to be able to take him or her with you? How long will this flight be for? And I just think in the humanitarian field, we have a responsibility to not be in our narratives just perpetuating these acronyms and slogans that we all work with. Wars are deeply and profoundly human experiences. And of course, in the ICRC also, through our neutrality and our confidentiality, we will find our own ways to spell things out. But there is always a risk that it becomes self-protective in part. And we are just an organization. If there's an organization that should be able to speak about what the human cost is, and not on behalf of people, but just through our own experience, we have to find the words better and to make it a more compelling case. And it's not about the attempt to present the ICRC so much. It's more to really say how deep and earth-shattering, traumatic is simply the experience of war. And we cannot allow narratives to develop which seem to glorify war as simply as we often do, because that is the first stage. You glorify war. On this continent, I think most of us in our school years, of course, read the Iliad and the Odyssey. And we've all imagined who we would be, and would it be Achilles or somebody else? But in fact, the important part in those books is not about the gods and the heroes. It's about those who were tortured, raped, and displaced and murdered. And this is what is at the heart of the war. And the risk is, out of even those great narratives, we draw the glorified version of the war, when in fact the important version is what it has meant for people who never recovered from the trauma.
Thank you so much. I can see a question here, and then Tom, yes, at the back, please. And Tom, we'll take two together if we might.
Francis Jacobs, thank you very much for your very inspiring talk. Two quick questions. One is, how do you draw attention to the less familiar conflicts, so ones which hardly make it into the media at all? And my second question is, how much of your work is related to the legacy of conflicts which have ended? You mentioned that have disappeared people, but having once been in Argentina and met Las Abuelas de Primo de Mayo, whose work is still continuing, how much of your work is in that area as well?
Thank you.
Thank you. And Tom here.
Thank you, Tom Arnold, member of the IIA. A striking point you made is the fact that many of the conflicts in today's world are protracted conflicts. And as Francis just mentioned, the multiplicity of protracted conflicts and forgotten conflicts. Now, about 20 years ago, the UN made a serious effort in 2005 to build up its peacekeeping capacity. That seems to have dissipated. There is as far as I can see, very little capacity to begin to tackle, firstly, conflict prevention, and secondly, peace processes in conflicts in which they are needed. What are the chances of beginning to rebuild an international capacity to deal with this issue?
So much.
Yeah, should I take those two? Thank you. How do we draw attention to less familiar, visible conflict? It's in public terms a big challenge because it's always a similar pattern. Maybe 2 or 3 conflicts will dominate, and the others will really struggle. So if you take the work we're doing in the Central African Republic right now, actually receive also a lot of attention and support. The work we do in the Sahel, which again Ireland is very focused on together with us, but it's difficult to draw attention. There will be a peak maybe now with Mali and all the events that are currently taking place in Mali and the instability that has grown again. But it's with what happens in Ukraine and with Gaza very difficult to. The word compete isn't the right one, but it's just to be able to raise attention. I say in a very simple way that one of the reasons why I'm also proud to work with the ICRC and see the work that we're doing in the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement is that despite these levels of very different attention, we remain engaged in all these conflicts. So we have teams in the Central African Republic, we have teams in Haiti working in very difficult urban violence, gang violence environments. We have teams that are still in Afghanistan, although everybody has now turned away essentially from the context. So you can take all of this, and so despite the lack of attention, we're still heavily engaged in those. But it means sometimes we create events, special briefings, but it will always be difficult to compete with others. Your point on the legacy of wars is very important. So we deal with many. Last year we had one example which was unexpected, just in terms of the peak of requests that we received, mostly from Italian, French, and German families who were coming for further information about missing relatives from World Wars I and II. It was a peak year in our archives because we have archives that go back to those world conflicts. So we had further documentation on prisoners of war, and other protected persons. We can give information. I found the capture card of my own grandfather in the ICRC archives a couple of decades ago. So that's why I was saying each of our family histories goes back somewhere to a reality that is related to it. But we also have other legacy issues that are very present in the work that we do. One is precisely the issue related to anti-personnel mines, because they don't stop working the day the ceasefire is declared. And since that's a debate, including in Europe currently, that is very much on the return and the use of anti-personnel mines, and the withdrawals that I mentioned earlier by several states, we just have to remember in Afghanistan, which now has seen a completely different situation since the change of government in August 2021, we have every year 200,000 patients in Afghanistan going to our 7 physical rehabilitation centers. So these are the majority people who are still victims or becoming or recent victims of landmine explosions, mostly, and others, of course, who were injured years ago and come for additional, also new fittings, especially for younger victims. But it just tells you how long you will carry the consequences of this. In the case of the United Kingdom and Argentina, you were referring to Argentina, we are still working on some of the missing servicemen, women. There's still work supporting processes that are of exhumation and identification of locations of burial, and start working closely with both parties. So it just tells us how long we will continue to work on these consequences, and especially how deep these issues remain in the conscious and subconscious of societies for very long. And this is passed down, as we know now, in the meantime, across generations, right? So these epigenetic studies and everything that show that we often focus on, how the color, hair, and eyes that we inherit from previous generation, but that's the easy part. It's the fingerprints in our souls that have been imprinted by the traumas of previous generations in times of conflict that are also very present. The peacekeeping that you mentioned, Tom, I think, so what in part probably happened to that, I think, proud tradition in the UN system was it wasn't necessarily integrated clearly enough with the actual management of the conclusion of the conflict. So peacekeeping forces became, at a certain moment, a bit like humanitarian response, an element of accompanying societies during times of war, as opposed to what it means, peacekeeping. There should be peace negotiated, and then you keep it through a force of interposition. And I think they found themselves caught in that in part. Now, the other part is simply a gradual disinvestment and disengagement from this proud and important dimension of the UN's work in particular. There has to be a reinvention, probably, of that. I think overall, also in the ICRC, we feel just how important the peace and security pillar of the United Nations mandate is, because we see what happens when that one is weaker. We see the consequences of it in the conflict. So we really call for that to be, and I hope, this is really a hope, that after we built the League of Nations and then lost it to the next World War, and then built the United Nations after the last major calamity, that we don't have to plunge into the abyss again before we become wise and create the next incarnation. Can we once deeply revisit and recreate the basis, but without having to dive into the next catastrophe? That's a little bit to see if we can achieve that.
Thank you so much. And I see Jill, and I have a question online. I'll add to this round, if I may. Vienna Page, who's a master's student in humanitarian action, asks about the increase in violence against humanitarian workers. So you've spoken very powerfully, and I think that image will stay with me, the fingerprints on one's soul of the impact on populations. But of course, those who are seeking to help them, seeking to respond, are coming under sometimes targeted attack, deliberate and strategic attack. What one thing or what particular action might shift the dial on that, or what might the kind of catalytic or transformative change around that particular challenge to humanitarian response look like? And then Jill, I think, has a question in front. Thank you.
Mine was pretty similar as well. I was just wondering about the practical impact, because we've all been shocked at the images of ambulances and medics and ambulance workers being attacked. And how do you regenerate not just the spirit of the volunteers, but also the numbers of volunteers? Since you said, I think at one stage, that a lot of the volunteers are local as well, so the impact on the community is huge. And the second part of it was, if I may, just to ask about galvanizing perhaps journalists, because we've seen also attacks on journalists, and they really have a role to play in narrative. And yesterday we heard from a previous speaker about being generators of empathy, because in effect the strong man politics, as Mark Carney described, where war, in fact, is something victorious, something that strong men do. And it has affected the narrative of how glorious peace is and how important the work of peacemakers is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So on the humanitarian workers, yeah, it is very shocking because we remember 2 decades ago, years 2003, 2005, we also in the ICRC had several losses of colleagues in Afghanistan and Iraq. And every single time there were demonstrations by spontaneous solidarity demonstrations by almost all staff from the UN, from NGOs, from the Red Cross, that would go down to the square in Geneva in front of the UN building. Today, we can't keep up anymore because the numbers are so extremely high. So, of course, Gaza contributed significantly to that, but it's Sudan, DRC, Ukraine, and many other contexts that have seen the deaths and injuries to humanitarian workers. Lebanon recently, colleagues again in the Iranian Red Crescent, the Lebanese Red Crescent, the Lebanese Red Cross, the Sudanese Red Crescent have also suffered great losses. And of course, many other local organizations, NGOs, and the UN system with UNWRA, since you were referring to it earlier in the Gaza Strip. And I think what we feel is, in a sense, you can't separate that from these harmful and dehumanizing narratives that are impacting also civilians, because to address the point on humanitarians, you won't fundamentally address it unless we course correct on the messaging and the actions taken in general for the protection of civilians. Because if it is easy to come to your point, Jill, to target today an ambulance and then later say, well, there were people transporting weapons in them, it has always been possible to stop an ambulance at a checkpoint to verify whether something else was in it. And these narratives that it's simply, let's shoot now, we ask later, or we shoot now and then we have a self-justifying narrative and that carries the day, is just not acceptable. It's just not the way that we will be able to preserve. I mean, the level of destruction in hospitals in conflicts today, I think it's documented by WHO that in 2025, it was 1,300 attacks against medical installations in conflict zones that led to the death or injury of 1,900 people, patients, staff, and others that were in these hospitals in conflict environments. These are very, very serious numbers. But if we don't deal with the permissive interpretations of IHL, if we don't deal with these, and again, to come to the dehumanizing narratives, because that's what we see also directed at our organization at times, very aggressive criticism online against humanitarian organizations, sometimes individuals, sometimes teams. That, of course, we haven't found a solution to be very honest, because it's a phenomenon that has gone to scale at such speed that we are still really grappling with it. But I think the two things are interconnected. The 2 points are very much linked.
An interesting point, and one I think we've come back to sometimes within our Red Cross discussions here in Ireland around misinformation and disinformation and around humanitarian response. And I think something that we'll continue to grapple with, all of us. There's a question online from James O'Shea who asks, I think, a question about a particular contribution, saying, when working on conflicts in the South Caucasus for Ireland and for the OSCE, I was privileged to work closely with ICRC colleagues on the subject of missing persons and to bring some of the experience from our own island to the attention of conflict parties. And this resonates with me because I think we've seen a number of areas where Ireland has made quite a technical contribution, maybe building on its own experience, whether that's in peacekeeping or in areas like this. And James asks, are there other areas where Ireland might have a particular contribution to make in the work of ICRC?
So there are different levels. I'll start with the overarching one, which is, as a country, you have experienced through the period of the Troubles the impact on society of extreme polarization, armed violence, and of course also of the path that was taken, a courageous path, to negotiate a way out of that phase. Now, that really requires a lot of recognition. I find in today's world, That's a real source of inspiration. That's something that Ireland can uniquely contribute to having said, yes, we've lived through it. We've gone through what it means in every single family, street, neighborhood, etc., and its consequences that reverberated, of course, across the entire island. And then we have chosen the path of courage to go and confront both, I guess, the demons, the traumas, the violence, the polarization, by accepting that a negotiated path was the legitimate way. And I find that very important because in today's discourse, in armed conflict environments, what we encounter the most is the statements on where politicians will say, well, I declare herewith that we will never talk to the other one again, ever. And so political courage in today's world being measured in the strength with which one says we will never talk again. And so if that's the measure of political courage in our world today, then I find that an awkward definition. I find much more courageous in times of polarization the person that says, yes, he or she is my enemy, but we need to continue to discuss. Even while the confrontation goes on, we might not have resolved it, but we have to have a path. And this is where there's also a link to international humanitarian law. The better you respect the rules during times of conflict, the more you reduce the suffering inflicted on the other, the easier is the pathway out of the time of polarization. If, of course, both sides have tortured detainees to death, disappeared thousands of people, and buried them in mass graves without any information to the families, the path towards dialogue and reconciliation will be so much longer and more painful. So there is also a link between the way in which the rules are applied during times of war and how you come out of it. So that's one very important contribution, is the re-legitimizing the negotiated path, the role of the mediator. I think there Ireland can bring something very important. And your role, and I find that very consistent, then the link to the respect and the application for the defense of international humanitarian law, but not just in general words, but in actions, as was on EWIPA, but also now in the context of the work that we're carrying out of this global initiative. It's very important as well. And then, of course, there's a lot of talented Irish colleagues that have joined the ICRC, not to mention, of course, talented colleagues in the Irish Red Cross. And that's a human skill, commitment, and endeavor and passion about the issues we deal with that is of a great value and can only encourage more to seek to join.
Thank you so much. I know there are other questions both in the room and online. We're coming close to the end of our time, and I did want to save time for a very important question. I began with your bio, which mentioned 30 years dedicated to humanitarian response to the humanitarian sector. That's not just a formality. You invited us to imagine a horizon where we don't despair. And I wanted to ask you something we don't maybe take stock of often enough within the humanitarian sector. There have been enormous improvements in many ways, whether it's in the technology of humanitarian response, the scale of response, the impact or effectiveness of interventions or other areas. In 30 years in your career, what would be the achievement or the change that you might most mark so that we might continue to imagine horizons without despair?
That's probably the most difficult question because it's almost brings it back to our contributions. And I generally prefer to look to where the source of inspiration has come from that keeps us going, in fact, every single day in our colleagues. And I have to say that what inspires us in general is, first of all, to observe the strength and the courage of people who are impacted by the war. Because long before any of us arrive, it's the families themselves. So even if we say localization of humanitarian aid, but even forget that. At the beginning, it's the family and the neighborhood, and they will support one another. And when you see some of our colleagues also, if you just look at, for example, colleagues in Ukraine or in the Gaza Strip or in Sudan, we recently had one of our colleagues join an internal call on Sudan, a colleague who was in Tawila and had herself fled with her family from El Fasher and had just arrived in Tawila, and then they were happy to have survived that trek, but they were then immediately engaged in responding to the needs of the other displaced people who were arriving. I think that is what I find inspiring, is that despite the polarization, despite the dehumanization, despite the risks that one could encounter, to despair and to become and to lose courage in face of so much violence around us, that there are every year, every generation, people who are prepared to commit and to respond. But again, I say the strongest inspiration we draw is from the courage of families who have get displaced 12 times in the Gaza Strip, families who were impacted during the winter now in Ukraine by the energy cuts and the freezing temperatures, in addition to all the other challenges and horrors they were confronting, and et cetera, et cetera. And my colleagues here can also list personal experiences in so many ways. And I think because of that, when we see this, we don't have the luxury to give up. We don't have the luxury to say we're skeptical. That's one of the forms that I always heard when I was working in different humanitarian settings. People saying, well, we're skeptical about this prospect, or that. We don't have the luxury of being skeptical. If we're not ourselves impacted directly by that conflict, we have the great privilege and responsibility of working and of finding the path in a very complex environment. That's our responsibility. The rest is just our deep respect and the need for humanity to be preserved. And that's the role that we'll continue to carry.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Olga Magli. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.